Hello, good evening, everyone. Mariah, are we good to go?
Yes, we are.
Amazing. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Kasiku Kayuma, Social Innovation and Research Associate here at BongoHive, and we are thrilled to have you all here for what promises to be a powerful and eye-opening conversation on corporate governance for in Zambia for startups. When most people think of startups, they think of innovation, disruption, and agility, but not many immediately think of governance. Yet, the truth is, governance is not just for big corporations. It's the silent engine that drives sustainability, accountability, and trust. So tonight we'll unpack exactly what that the how and the why of corporate governance for emerging businesses is very important. So together with our esteemed guests today, who will be talking to us, Moira legal practitioners, they'll be bringing to us the wealth of legal and practical insight into how startups can not only comply with the law but also thrive because it's essential. So, whether you are with us here and you're a founder, you're a team member, or you're simply passionate about building responsible enterprises, you're in the right place. And to get us started, I will just hand over to Chimwemwe, who will introduce herself. She will introduce the firm, Moira Legal Practitioners, and she will tell us what has inspired um, Moira Legal Practitioners to take an interest in startup governance and from her experience, why she thinks it's important. Over to you, Chimwemwe. And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Kasiku. I'm happy to be here. So good evening, everyone. My name is Chimwemwe Walia. I'm a senior associate at Moira Legal Practitioners, a law firm in Lusaka. So as Kasiku has mentioned, we have partnered with BongoHive to just share the insights that we've seen as we practice law in Zambia. So I'll start with the service areas and I'll explain where this need and this desire to share what we've learned and what we came across, where it came from. So we are a full service law firm and our practice areas are mainly, as you can see, corporate commercial law, capital markets, project finance, banking and finance, data protection, tax, corporate restructuring, employment labor, and what you can see. We also deal with a lot of mergers and acquisition. So as we provide advice, what we have noted is that with respect to startups, there was an emerging issues. Normally, when startups want to receive financing, investors request a due diligence on the startup to see how the startup is running their business and if their affairs are in order. So as we conduct these due diligences, we did note that with respect to many startups, they lose opportunities obtaining capital to just expand their business because of the way the business is run. And normally it's not because the startup does not want to comply with the law, but because they do not know. So this need to just sensitize the startups in Zambia came from what we've seen just to assist startups as they consider even going public in the future with respect to IPOs or just obtaining financing. So that's where this came from. And we're just happy to share some key points with everyone.
Thank you so much, Chimwemwe, for that. At this point, I'll just ask and request that you run us through what is the roadmap? What are we looking at discussing this particular evening? And before Chimwemwe does that. In the comment section, Mariah has shared her email. If you have any questions that you would like with regards to the topic, it could be now, it could be during the session or at the end. Please email your questions to her, and then we'll be able to address some of them at the end of the session and the rest during our next session, because this is just a kickoff, and that's why we are tagging it Corporate Governance 101. And we will definitely have more sessions to discuss more issues. So, Chimoma, please run us through the roadmap for this session.
So in this session, I'm going to give you an overview of why corporate governance matters for your business, and also just a brief overview of the legal and regulatory landscape. So as Kasiko has mentioned, we will have further sessions which will delve into more detail, but this is just a session to help you understand what you can do. And then I'll also explain board structures and best practices for your business, just a starter pack, what you can start putting in place, and what you need to even have put in place prior to this session if you have an operating business, and also just the licensing and investment readiness. So this is what I'm going to take you through. And before I even delve into the nitty-gritties, I would want you to have an appreciation of exactly why corporate governance matters for your business. So I will give you a scenario. So, and this is with respect to investment. So you have found an angel investor for your startup. So, and this angel investor states that they are willing to invest 200,000 US dollars into this product that you want to put on the market. And this is great. So it will help you scale up your business. And the investor has shown willingness, and before they invest, as investor had mentioned earlier, they have to conduct a due diligence on your business just to see if there are any risks before they invest. So while the investor is conducting their due diligence, they do approach several stakeholders. So in this case, the investor would approach people to look at the legal aspects, and this is what I'll be taking you through. The tax aspects, they want to see, is this company compliant? They are looking at several elements. And while the investor is looking at these things, they see, okay, this company has tax clearance. This is great. This company has a NAPSA certificate. This is great. Then one issue emerges from this. The investor finds out that just a week before the deal is signed, there is a conflict between the founders. So you are one of the founders and you're having a conflict with the other founder regarding the equity. So the investor finds this out and they say, oh, okay, so even though this company has got filings, there are some issues with respect to, I think there are some wrangles between the founders. And then the investor also discovers that there are no filings at the company's registry. So the investor says, oh, there's no compliance in this case. In as much as this is a good product and I'm willing to invest, this is too risky for me because there is no proper corporate governance. So apart from the filings, you would wonder, so if internally we're having issues, what's the risk for the investor? So this is now this is where good governance comes in. In this specific case, what the investor found out is that when you and your co-founder had incorporated your business, you incorporated as friends because it was a good business idea, but you did not have a formal shareholders agreement, which even explains this particular conflict that is between you. So you don't have an agreement. That's problematic. The investor also discovers that with respect to the equity split, it's quite unclear. Then the investor also discovers that with respect to the board structure, you and the co-founder both run the business, but there are no clear structures with respect to how the company is run. So when the investor sees this, they say this is high risk and they walk away and you lose out on that 200,000 US dollars. So what could you have done differently in this case? So from the beginning, as a startup, you should have had an agreement. Even if you have a relationship with this person, a friendship, it's so important to have a shareholders agreement that just explains the rights, the roles between the two of you as founders of the business. Then even with respect to board minutes, there are no board minutes in the company. So how are you running? What are the decisions? The investor discovered that they don't know how you're running it. Why should they invest? In as much as you have shown the investor that it can be lucrative, this is too risky for them. So even with respect to being a director, you see that the investor can see that, no, this company, in as much as this is a good deal, I'll walk away because this is really risky. Even from a regulatory point of view, I feel that I will not get back my money because at the end of the day, the investor wants a return. Now, if there are any litigation issues, if there are any issues with regulators, you're not filing with PACRA, what happens? The investor will not get a return. So that's why corporate governance is very important. The investor wants to see stability and clarity in your business. So what we've seen is that many companies who have very good products, they provide very good services, they do lose out because from the beginning, the companies do not regularize their affairs. So so that's why we thought this would be very important. And as I'm speaking, if you have any questions, please, Maria has put her email in the chat box. You can put your questions there, and you can also send an email to her, and I'll be able to tackle the same.
Thank you so much, Chimwemwe, for that. So maybe now we can actually dive into the conversation with regards to corporate governance. So when we talk about corporate governance, it can sound like something reserved for big corporations or listed companies. Could you please break it down for us? Like, what exactly does corporate governance mean in the startup context, and why is it something even a two-person team should think about from day one?
So when we speak of corporate governance, really it's just a term that means the structures and processes that the company puts in place as they direct and control it. So as you're providing your services, as you are selling the goods, there need to be some systems and structures that are put in place to ensure that the company is run in a manner that is legally compliant, regulatory compliant. So what we look at with corporate governance is we look at how the decisions are made by the directors, we look at how the decisions are made by the founders, who are the shareholders, who makes these decisions, and what power and responsibility do they have. So there needs to be some form of separation of responsibilities. So most times when founders start a business, they are the shareholders of the business, and then they're also the directors of the business. So there is usually an overlap with respect to their responsibilities, but this is quite problematic because under Zambia's Companies Act, there is a distinction between the two. So it's important from the beginning for the founders, even if they're directors, to know exactly what their roles are, the roles of the shareholders in a company and also the roles of the director. Then we also, with corporate governance, in as much as it looks at the members, it looks at the directors, it also looks at management, it looks at the employees. So corporate governance looks at how are the structures put in place in this specific company. So the core elements of this, the starting point is accountability. Who are the decision makers of the company? When you look at the various acts here in Zambia and the penalties, so these acts require you to comply. For example, the Tax Act, you're required to pay tax to the government. So this being income tax, and if you are a startup, usually it's turnover tax. So if you do not comply, what happens? In as much as there is a fine for the company, most times you see that there is a penalty which states that the company is the one that will pay the fine or imprisonment. The question that you ask yourself, who is going to be imprisoned? Is it the company? No. is going to be the officers of the company who are the directors. So that's why it's important to know that from the beginning, you are accountable as a director of the company. You have to be able to justify your actions, and ignorance is not a defense. The law is quite clear. So the reporting lines have to be very clear. That's the accountability element. Then transparency. In as much as it's your company, you are the founder, you are the director, you have to be very transparent from the beginning about the company's activities, about the financial status of the company, because you might wonder, but why should I share my financial status? If you're to receive funding, who is going to give you the finances without seeing your accounts? So this is something that you need to take into account. These things are not private. Most times people will form a company at Parker as a private company and think, I don't have to share this information. But if you want to expand, if you want to scale up, if you want that working capital, you need to be aware from the beginning that transparency is required. So even with respect to the financial status, that's something that you have to be transparent about. The strategy of the company, the investors want to know what's the strategy, what's your 10-year plan. This is sustainability. The investor wants to make sure that the company is not going to be liquidated next year. I put the 200,000 US dollars in your business, and then the next year I find out that the company was wound up. So this is very important. This has to be openly shared with the stakeholders. So the transparency also helps to build trust with the investors that you have, and even the employees. Transparency does help with that. It does help build trust and the public, because you want to receive. So if you are providing goods, if you're providing services, there's some form of transparency that you need to have with the public. So this is one of the principles that you need to take into account. So an example of transparency would be ensuring that your accounts are audited. If you have an independent person to audit, that will help, where they'll be able to show you. In as much as you're a startup, you might think, I don't need to audit, but it's so important for someone, an independent party, to audit your financial statements so that they can advise you where the gaps are. And this is something important for startups to consider from the beginning, because as Kasiko had mentioned, corporate governance is not just for the big companies, but even for your startup. You need to consider this from the beginning. And then with respect to fairness, the way you operate. So you have different stakeholders. You have to be very fair with the way you treat them. Employees, people are looking at that. So this is something that we call ESG, and we will discuss it in in other sessions that we'll have subsequently. So that's environmental, social, and governance. But then the social part, people are looking at, how are you treating your employees? You need to be fair. How are your contracts? This is one of the elements. Your shareholders. So you as a founder, for example, you have 90%. So you and your co-founder have 90% collectively, and you leave 10% for other investors. These are minority shareholders. Just because you hold 90% doesn't mean that you just have to make all the decisions with disregard for the minority shareholders. The Companies Act is quite clear. These minority shareholders have rights, and that's corporate governance. There's a law behind all these principles. If you do not act in fairness, then the minority shareholders can take you to court. So that's also more legal action, in addition to what was mentioned, the issue between the founders. So you need to be fair and ensure that with respect to all the shareholders, you provide equal access to information. You can't say just because this person holds 2% and you hold 90% of the shares, you cannot disclose the information. No, the shareholder needs to know exactly what is happening in the company. Then with respect to responsibility, so I will explain the director's duties later on, but from the onset, you need to be aware that as a director, you have a duty of care. So as I'm speaking, you hear me mentioning the shareholders and the directors. There are different responsibilities, and I'll be able to explain that clearly because I know you might think there's an overlap, but then it's quite clear under the Companies Act what the two can do. That's why from the onset with corporate governance, you have to be very clear. You have to understand who has the responsibility to do what. And the responsibility aspect, it does help you to manage risk and to comply with the law. So it's very important. It will help you comply with the environmental regulations depending on your business, with the social regulations. It will help you and also to maximize your profits. So for startups, here I've stated that governance is not the same as bureaucracy. So it's not just about having stringent laws. So you can have some policies in place, but the idea of corporate governance is not just a set of rules, but the goal is to ensure that your business grows. And there's also sustainability, because if you're making profits and then you have issues with the regulator. So with the regulators, most people who have startups, I think if some people might have experienced that, you miss a deadline, you haven't paid NAPSA, that's the social pension scheme, you haven't paid that for your employees, you haven't paid tax. What happens in that case? In addition to the tax that you have to pay, now and a penalty is imposed, you have to pay interest. This is taken away from your profits. So from the onset, it's just important to take into account that for a company, for corporate governance, it's really about putting things in order just to ensure that your company is run in a sustainable fashion. And I'll give you some examples of what corporate governance looks like. So with the board of directors, it has to be, so the board of directors, this is not just one director. When a company is incorporated, this is a startup, you have two directors. So those two directors, when they make decisions, that's a board. So it has to be very clear what powers the board has. The two directors make the decisions. But usually we also advise that in addition to those two, it's really good corporate governance to also have another director that does help with respect to making decisions. But it has to be clear that in the event that you do not agree, how are the decisions made? This has to be very clear from the onset. Who has the strategic oversight? The investors want to know that there's a board. And how will they know this? They are going to look at your minutes. You need to have board minutes. You need to have resolutions. If you are going to be making decisions, you can't tell an investor and say, we have a board. If you have a board, the investor wants to see, where are your board minutes? Can I see the decisions that you're making? So this is something that they are looking at. Management, it has to be clear who is managing the company. This is part of the structure. And then policies and procedures. These are very, very important. So from a labor law perspective, I'll give you an example. You need to have policies and procedures. Employees need to understand what they're required to do. So you need to have the disciplinary procedures, you need to have the handbook, you need to have everything in place, because this is something that the Ministry of Labor is looking at. Do the employees understand exactly what they're required to do? And this is in addition to a contract. So even as a startup, when you employ people, it's also important to have that written contract, because from the onset, the Labor Commissioner is looking at this, the Ministry of Labor. Then other policies that you need to put in place, there are different laws that you need to comply with, depending on the sector that you're in. For most businesses, there's this new, it's not a new law necessarily, but it came into effect in 2021. But in terms of enforcement, this act began to be enforced this year. So this is the Data Protection Act. So one of the policies that you need to have is a data protection policy, which determines how you process your personal data. And I'll explain that later when I'm dealing with the legal aspects. I will explain that. But what I want you to know is that when it comes to policies, you have to have policies for different things. If you're sharing your data, you need to have policies for that. When it comes to the issue here is I think what we advise a lot of startups is, okay, you've incorporated your business, and most times startups would do that without advice. And now, what sector are you operating in? What employees do you have? You sit down, you assess, and I will give you a cheat sheet later on, which can help you with that. But you need to sit down and assess the exact policies that you need to put in place for your business. Just the starting policies, then as you expand, you can add the other policies. So this is something that I just wanted to highlight. And even in terms of internal controls, so for your business, how do you protect your assets? You have purchased these assets. You've used your money to purchase the assets. What are the internal controls? How are they protected, even with respect to funding? petty cash. What processes do you have in place to ensure that this is accounted for? You need to ensure that your internal controls are in order. Otherwise, you're going to that you won't receive profits because of your internal controls. So even with respect to stakeholder engagement, you need to ensure that there's some form of mechanism for feedbacks with employees. I know that employees are assessed by their employers, but do you have a system in place to receive some feedback from your employees? Do you have a system in place to receive feedback from your clients? You need to understand exactly what you're doing. You don't want to find out later on that an investor didn't invest in your business because there's a bad, I should say, rumor about your business. You need to get feedback about that. So this is something that's important. And as I mentioned, external oversight is very important just to ensure that you are compliant. So this is really the basics of corporate governance. Then in terms of the importance, as I've mentioned, so as we do this due diligence, I think we also deal with clients who provide financing to businesses. So we conduct the due diligences, and what we've seen is that for the investors, what they want to just see is that there's a structure that they can trust this particular business. So when I say investor, it could be financing, or you want someone to buy equity into your business, just depending on what you're looking for. But whoever is investing in your business wants to ensure that at the end of the day, that your business is being run in a way that's compliant with regulation, and you also make profit. So it's not just the revenue that they look at. Then with respect to licensing, regulators require governance proof. So BongoHive has partnered with a lot of companies that require to be licensed with the Bank of Zambia, with the Securities and Exchange Commission. And in that case, they want to see how are you running this business, even with respect to the directors. They're looking at these, are these fit and proper persons? Are there any issues with this? Do they have the necessary qualifications? So even from a licensing point of view, depending on the business that you have, it is important before you obtain the specific license to show the governance of the business and that you are compliant. So many people have probably experienced this, where the regulator may even ask for things such as the tax clearance certificate. Now, you know that from a ZRA point of view, when you deal with the regulator, you cannot receive that certificate if you have any outstanding liabilities. Those are issues. Some regulators even go further. They might even ask for the NAPSA certificate. So there are all those issues. That's why it's important to avoid delays. When you're trying to obtain your license, it's important to just regularize your affairs. And with partner trust, we mentioned the employees. It's something that I've mentioned, the investors. You just want to build that trust. And with respect to scaling up, so this is where you as a startup, and some people have great ideas. It's something that we've seen in Zambia countless times. We've dealt with startups from that point of view. You have a great business idea, you start your business, it becomes profitable, and then now you want to sell your business. So that's where the mergers and acquisitions aspect comes in. You want to sell the business. So before someone even purchases your business, they want to know, is this business sustainable? How can a business be sustainable if there are a lot of issues there? You have issues with so many regulators, but then it's a great business. So there's that. And then even between the founders, there are disputes. Someone approaches one founder and the founder says, oh, we can sell the business. So you and your co-founder hold 50%. So you with 51% approach someone to purchase your shares. And then the person says, I don't want to purchase 51%. I want to purchase everything. But then you're having issues with your co-founder. What happens in that case? You miss out on that opportunity, and it's really good money. But if you had the shareholders agreement, the one that I had spoken about earlier, this is something that can even deal with these disputes. For example, some shareholders agreements can even can state how if this particular person brings this specific income, the other person is forced to sell. These are things that you put in shareholders agreement.
Thank you so much, Chimwemwe, for that. Thank you for sharing what corporate governance is, its importance for startups. Now, let's talk about the legal side of things. what are the key laws, the regulators, or the compliance requirements that Zambian founders should be aware of, particularly those that are looking to scale and attract investment. There are a lot of founders that say navigating PACRA, ZRA, and data protection laws feel intimidating. So, are there any practical steps as you go on in your presentation or best practices you would recommend to make compliance less overwhelming?
So in order to make compliance less overwhelming, I think the starting point is for you to even understand what laws apply to you. So this is just a legal framework of the key instruments, the ones that you should consider. So there are various laws that are applicable, but this is just an overview of the laws that would typically apply to a business. So once you incorporate your business and the business is running, the first thing that you should know is the accounting records. I think this is something that I want to mention because it's so important from an investor's point of view. And I think I've mentioned it, but under the Companies Act, it does require you as a company, the company to keep proper accounting records. And the purpose of this is that you must be able to show that there is a true and fair view of just the way the business is run, the state of affairs of your business. You must be able to show that. So the starting point is please ensure you have proper accounting records. So this includes the payment receipts, the assets, the liabilities. This has to be very clear because these have to support the preparation of your financial statements. If you are to audit the business, the auditors will ask for this payment receipt. So please keep documentation. Your accounting records, the financial reporting is very important. And it's also for you. So it's for you to know that this is something that's in the Companies Act. It's a legal requirement. You can't say, no, I did not know. At least now that we're having this discussion, it's important for you to understand, because when we speak about these accounting records, when you're dealing with different regulators, they will request for this. They will request for the accounting records. So the starting point, please ensure that you know how you're going to keep the records that you have. Then even with respect to annual returns, I think there are some companies that do not know that they need to file annual returns every single year. So this is with the company's registrar. So that's the Patents and Companies Registration Agency. So it's important for the company to file. So what these annual returns do is that they give the registrar updated information about your business. So they explain, are there any new directors? Has the share capital changed? The shareholders, the registered address? But even without the annual returns, it's important to note that under the Companies Act, if anything, and I mean anything, changes with your business, it's important to inform the registrar. So if you change your registered address, if you have a new director, if you have a new shareholder, and if all these things, if there's a new beneficial owner, the person who ultimately owns those shares, it's important to update PACRA. So this is something that you need to keep into account. And also beneficial ownership, I just want to provide some clarification. So after this session, I would like to ask for most of the startups to obtain a company printout and just see if you are compliant following what I've stated. So the law changed with respect to the fees, which increased what the authorized share capital should be of a company. So for the minimum share capital prior was 15,000, and when most companies had incorporated their business, they incorporated with 15,000 for 15,000 authorized shares. But what we've seen with many companies that when we conduct due diligence on them is that they haven't updated this. So one thing you can also do for your business is to see if you've updated that 15,000, if you've increased it to 20,000. So that's one of the requirements. So the law does change regularly. externally. That's why I did mention that it's important to have someone externally, even a legal advisor, to just help ensure that at least that you are up to date with what the law provides, because it is constantly changing. Then from the beneficial ownership point of view, you need to update the beneficial ownership register. So you're informing PACRA who ultimately owns those shares. With a startup, typically the owner of the shares could be you as the founder, but there are other times where maybe you formed the company on behalf of another person. If there's another person who's ultimately controlling that, you need to be very clear and notify PACRA. And this is a very big requirement. It's very, very important. PACRA wants to know who has the power to control the company. It's so important for you to do that. And then if you are so for certain startups, if you have a fintech, if you have a banking, a financial business, even if it's a small financial business, some form of financial services, it's important to note that you cannot conduct that without a license. The act prohibits that. So that's the starting point. And if you do that, there'll be fines, penalties, and you could also be in prison. So it's so important to ensure that you understand. Firstly, you need to know what business am I operating, what services am I providing, and from there, if it's a financial service under the Banking and Financial Services Act, it's important to obtain that registration. But before you even obtain that registration, there's criteria that you need to meet, because the Bank of Zambia, who's the regulator, is not just going to give you that license because, oh, I have this service. Do you have things in place in order for you to get that license? Because let's say you get the license, you need to remember that they routinely inspect to ensure that you're compliant. They'll request access to your records. So you obtain the license, but then how do you even renew it? They request access to your record. They could even impose restrictions on you. You don't want that. So from the beginning, it's just important for you to know exactly what will the regulator require of me, and that's where the advice comes in. If you've read the act, you've read the regulations, and there are several regulations, and you don't understand. So it's so important. I think for people who operate in the financial services sector, it really is important to obtain advice so that you ensure that even as you are applying for the license, or even as you are trying to renew, or even put new products on the market, it's so important that when you approach the regulator, because you have everything in order, they just approve it. And what you'll see with regulators in Zambia, the experience we have, because I've been working in the compliance and the regulatory sector for over 6 years. And what I've seen with regulators is, as long as you are compliant, or even you show that you're trying to be compliant, I think you won't have any problems. I know most people say, no, I think the regulators are difficult. No, the experience that we've had is, as long as on the preparation stage, you really have put your documents, everything is in order, the regulator is not problematic. So that's something that is important to note. And even with respect to the Securities Act, there are some people who provide investment advice. I'm sure most of you have seen that. Even on the socials, online, you see people providing investment advice. So you cannot give that investment advice to the masses if you are not licensed. You cannot act as a broker. The Securities Act is very clear. So Zambia's legal framework is quite comprehensive. So you'll be providing certain services and you'll be thinking that, oh no, I'm just doing this on the side, it's nothing big. No, the regulators are watching. People have been sanctioned. And you know what happens under the Securities Act? The minute they tell you that you should not have been doing this, they fine you, they publish. So that's your reputation. They'll publish in the newspaper, they'll publish on Facebook, they'll publish on LinkedIn. That's a reputational issue for your business. So to avoid that, what do? You ensure that you have the right license, because sometimes you may obtain a license, but it's not the correct license for your business. So that's why from the beginning, it's important to understand, what products am I offering? What does the law say about that? And then you obtain obtain the necessary license. Because sometimes you might think, I'm providing investment advice, so why is the regulator, why is Zambia heavily regulated with respect to that? So for example, the Securities and Exchange Commission. So the capital markets, people have to be protected. So many people are aware of the numerous scams that have been happening in Zambia. And you'll see that for the Securities and Exchange Commission, they have put out various notices saying, no, this is a scam. And for some of the people who are operating, they've said, we stop this person from operating because they did not have the relevant license. So the idea behind the regulation, it's not to make it difficult for you to operate. No, it's just to ensure that the public is protected, just the way you want to be protected. In as much as you think that these are hurdles, no, the idea is to protect the public, just to ensure that unscrupulous individuals do not take advantage of people. So the regulator does watch to ensure that. Then now with data protection, this is something I mentioned earlier on. So with this new act, so as you're operating your business, you collect personal data of individuals. So what is personal data? So this is a name of a person. You collect their NRC, anything that can be used to identify a person, even if it's their plate number. So as long as some sort of information can be used to identify an individual, not a company, but an individual. If you are a company that collects that personal data to do anything with it, if it's a customer, that's personal data you're collecting. Even your employees, if you collect the personal data, the name of your employee, you get their NRC, any details, that means that you are processing the personal data. And what does the act say? You must register with the Data Protection Commission. This is a fairly new requirement, but it's so important because the fine is quite high. And from the onset, I'll mention the fine. So how you can be fined if you're not compliant? If you don't register, you can be fined 2% of your annual turnover or 40 million. It's really quite high. So from the onset, the minute that you're obtaining personal data from your employees or you're obtaining personal data from customers, you need to register either as a data controller or a data processor. So these are things that in subsequent sessions we will mention, but this is a very important one, because why we even belabored to add it today is because the penalty is quite high. It's really quite high for non-compliance. So just think about it. Do you have that 40 million as a startup? Are you willing to give that to the Data Protection Commission? Are you willing to pay 2% of your annual turnover? No. So it's important to be compliant from the beginning. And also, if you're transferring data outside Zambia, it's important to also obtain to apply for that with the commission. So we will go in details later on, but this is just for you to have an appreciation of the legal framework that affects you. Then with respect to labor and tax laws, I did touch on it briefly. So these are the employment laws here in Zambia, and also the social security, the tax obligations. So the starting point is, please ensure to have written in employment contracts. Please ensure you have that with your employees. This would define the terms, the roles, the remuneration. And even as employees, most people who have businesses, at first you are an employee, but now you're an employer, and you see that employees can be quite litigious. And if you go to the labor courts, you'll find that I think they are quite fair to employees. So if you have something in writing, just as I had mentioned, the shareholders agreement, this is an agreement that was signed. So if you yourself as the employer have done everything that's in that employment contract, and the employee is just asking for something, just something out of the contract, you will be protected. So you don't want to say we had an oral contract. No, that will not protect you. For you to be protected, you need to have the employment contract. because even during the due diligence process, remember that the investor is going to ask, can you give me your employment templates? They'll see. Now, before I invest, can you give me a draft employment contract? I want to see, what are they checking for? They are checking for compliance to see if that employment contract is compliant. There are various terms that have to be there. Does it provide for a woman to have Mother's Day, the maternity leave? They're just different elements that have to be there. Can the employee get leave, the annual leave? So all these terms have to be in the employment contract. So you can't just draft something quickly, you get it off the internet. No. It's so important for you to ensure that that particular employment contract is compliant with the laws. And depending on the employee, the regulations are different. So for example, if you have a casual worker, if you have a gardener, if you have someone who's in a managerial position, the contract of employment would look different based on the law. So they'll also look at the hours, what does the contract of employment say, the minimum wages, and even with respect to NAPSA now, the National Pension Scheme Authority, the investor wants to know, are you making pension contributions? So you can tell the investor that you're making the pension contributions, but one thing I'll tell you what happens in practice is that when investors get lawyers to conduct this due diligence, they'll also ask the lawyer to take a step further and write to the regulator and say, can you advise us if there are any liabilities in this company? So you've told the investor that you're compliant, but they do their due diligence and then they find out that you haven't been paying NAPSA. There are penalties. That's problematic. So it's something that you need to ensure. Even for NEMA, are you registered for NEMA? So that's the National Health Insurance Management Authority. Are you registered with them for you to pay insurance? So there are some various regulations. So that's on the labor law aspect. Then for tax, so usually when you are incorporating a company, the tipping is automatic. That's the taxpayer identification number. But sometimes if it's not automatic, you make an application. Then following that, you want to know the tax type. You register for the specific tax type. Is it turnover tax? Is it corporate income tax? Then depending on also your company, is it presumptive tax? You just want to understand which income taxes apply to you. Then you also file. Then even VAT, you want to know, should I pay VAT or not? Are my services exempt? These are things you would want to know from the onset, because even if you're not paying that tax, what happens is that the ZRA will come and say, you've been making this income, you were supposed to be paying this specific tax, and then they are going to assess it for that with interest and penalties. So you don't want that issue. So from day one, from the onset, it's just important for you. What I can say based on what I've mentioned, the legal framework, classify your workers correctly. Why should you classify them correctly? Because the specific law that you need to know, the specific law, the provisions that apply to that worker. Then even with contracts, you need to know, should I collect withholding tax or is this a corporate income tax? These are things you need to know from day one to avoid penalties. Even the social security contributions, you need to know how this is done. Do I need to get someone to help me if you don't know how to do this? But what I would like to stress is what we've seen with companies sometimes is that the founders, so as a director, you are compliant and you outsource to someone, and that person is not compliant as they should. So you're paying someone to help you out with this, and then the person is not making the payments. So what should be wondering is what happens to me, because I did get someone to help me. I was paying them, but they weren't making the payments. Unfortunately, under the law, you are liable, especially if you're a director. So it's important to know that in as much as you have employees, you have an accountant to help you, you need to have structures in place to make sure that these people are doing the work, but there's oversight on your part, because where there's non-compliance, it's you as the director, and usually the director is the co-founder who will be liable, who could even be imprisoned for something that someone did. So this is something that we've seen commonly. So ensure that in as much as you do outsource, or you have people to help you, or you have employees, as a board, as the directors, you know exactly what is happening in your business, because ignorance is not a defense under the law. Then with respect to the key regulators, I think I've already touched on that, but I'll just mention some of the key regulators that you have. I did mention PACRA, just for you to know. So that's where you file your annual compliance, you update details with PACRA, the details within your company, the change of directors, anything, the shareholders, you maintain registers. So that's PACRA. Then you have the Bank of Zambia. I also touched on that, the Securities and Exchange Commission, ZRA, and then they are also sector specific. So if you are providing insurance products, that's a separate regulator, the Pensions and Insurance Authority. So you want to make sure that you know exactly what products or services you're providing, and you know the sector specific regulator that is there. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat. We will tackle the questions. Then I would just like, this is a cheat sheet that we prepared for you. You can just take a screenshot to just for you to know as a starting point what, from a regulatory point of view, what you should be considering. So this is just what I mentioned. Know who your sector specific regulator is. If you're providing health tech, you're providing health advice on an app, who is the regulator for that? You need to understand. So you wouldn't go to the Bank of Zambia in that case. So in as much as you've incorporated your company, you have this app, you have the investor, but do you understand exactly who is regulating you in the energy sector? So you want to provide all these solar products, renewable energy. And the beauty about what's happening right now with climate change is so many people want to invest in green products. So there are so many investors who want to invest in your products, but are you compliant before they invest in you? Have you complied? So some people don't have, some startups do not have sector specific regulators, but it's just important for you to know that from the onset. So I'll just give you a brief case study for you to have an appreciation of just how what I've said works. So you have this payment app, a startup. So it's an app, and you're thinking this app is online, and I want to operate it in Zambia. So since I don't have a physical space, I can just put the app on Google Play and operate. No, you can't do that. So because you're providing these financial services within the Zambian market, it's important for you. The starting point is this is a business. So the app, there's a company behind it, incorporate with PACRA. It's a business operating here in Zambia. And then also it's important to submit your license application. Now, you wonder why we put board structure before. So before you even obtain your license in order to operate from the Bank of Zambia for the financial services, the Bank of Zambia wants to know several things. So they want to see your certificate of incorporation. So yes, it's online, but then there has to be some form of accountability. So the bank will ask, where's the certificate of incorporation, the articles, the board resolutions? They want to see all of that. Even the capital. If you're going to be providing financial products, you need to have some form of minimum capital. So that's something that the Bank of Zambia wants to see. Then they also want to see your governance structure. How many directors do you have? So who are the executive directors, the non-executive, and they'll also look at the fit and proper, the requirements, they'll look at that. And also these particular directors, are they resident in Zambia? Who are resident in Zambia? Who are not resident in Zambia? This is something that you need to put in place even before you submit your application. So you incorporate the company, you start putting your affairs in order, you regularize your affairs, you put the documents, and then you approach the regulator. So it's important to not approach the regulator before you do this. So you seek guidance, and then you approach the regulator. So the advice that I would have in this case is, before you make an application to a regulator, it's prudent to even have those meetings before, just the meetings before the actual submission, to understand exactly what you need to do. Because once you submit the application, the regulator has to respond in accordance with the law. They have to do that. So before you do that, it's important to have those meetings. And that's where people who have good relationships with the regulators come in to be able to help you with that smooth process. Then this is an app. The regulator wants to know. So from a risk perspective, what's the cybersecurity framework? And I had mentioned data protection earlier. They also want to know how will these individuals' data be processed? Where is the server? In Zambia now, they want to know, is the server in Zambia or is the server outside Zambia? There are all these issues. So it's important to be able to show this even before you get your license, to just understand what you need to put in place. You start doing that, and then you approach the regulator and you operate your business. This will also help you get just more investors to scale up your business.
All right. Thank you so much for that, Chimwemwe. And maybe now we can go into discussing uh boards and governance structures. In Zambia, many startups struggle with the idea of forming a board early enough. They mostly feel it's only necessary once they've raised enough funding or they've grown the company to a certain level. So could you tell us why it is still important to formalize the board early? I know you earlier on you did touch a little bit on this, but also could you tell us, what does a lean but effective board structure look like in the Zambian startup scene?
So with the example I gave earlier, where there are issues between, I think the example I did give, it's important for the company, firstly, to have a minimum of 3 directors where there are issues between the directors. So if you have 2 directors and they do not agree with respect to making a decision, this could delay processes. So at least having 3 directors can help from a governance perspective, a minimum of 3, just from an early stage. So you have a mix between the founders. So in Zambia, you have to have a minimum of 2 directors. You have to have a minimum of 2 shareholders if it's a private company limited by shares. So in addition to this prescribed minimum, these 2 founders, these 2 shareholders, they need to get an independent person. It's so important to do that just to help with the running of the business. So that's basically the board composition and structure. So you have that independent person, the external advisor. They can even be a non-executive direction. It will help. And another thing that is also helpful is to have term length rotation. You don't want someone to be the director for 20 years. So it does help from a governance perspective to change that, to refresh. It's something that's very helpful. And also just to have committees to help make decisions. But another thing is that in this structure, what you can see here, the roles and responsibilities need to be clearly defined. Investors want to understand, how do you operate? Do you have a COO, a chief operations officer? Do you have the person who is managing? What are the specific roles in this case? These have to be clearly defined. What is the oversight? What does it look like? So if this founding shareholder, who is also a director, if this person takes money out of the company, how are they held accountable? So you'll be wondering, if I'm the owner of a business, I'm a shareholder and I'm a director, why should I not take money out of the company? Because the Companies Act is very specific with respect to how you can take money out of the company. You just can't do it anyhow. So it's something, so you need to know what are the responsibilities, who is providing oversight to ensure that you are compliant. So you also don't want micromanagement because it can affect the sustainability of the business. Then with respect to meetings, I had mentioned earlier that it's important for you to have board resolutions, board meetings. So building a credible board, at least try ensure to have quarterly meetings in a year. Then you also make sure that after you have those meetings, it's reduced in writing. The board minutes, the resolutions, these are things that you will show the investor. Not now when the investor is asking, can you show me your board minutes? You start scrambling. It's so important to do that. You hold regular meetings, and then you also keep records of those specific meetings. That's something that's very important, because from those specific minutes, it will be very, very clear what the roles and responsibilities are, exactly what is happening. So that's something that's important. Then even with respect to fiduciary duties, but I will explain this later, of the directors, the ethics, that's something that a credible board should have. The independence aspect has to be very clear from the minutes that the board is independent. Yes, you have 90% of the shares under the managing director, but if there's a board, it has to be clear that the board functions and you're not the only one who's making the decisions. So it's something that the investors are looking at. Also plan for leadership succession. This is something, so if you have a board chair for that specific board, you want to know, so are there any specific rules with respect to changing these specific people? What's the succession plan? It's so important to have that from the beginning. Cooling off periods, that has to be set. So, power is power. It's something that people enjoy. When you're managing the company, you don't want to leave. You're the best person to make the decisions for the company. But no, if you have something in writing, corporate governance says you have structures in place which say, yes, you've been running the company very well. Thank you very much for running the company for these specific years. But the corporate governance structures say that someone else has to come in place. Even if you are ready to take the company to the next level, the rules are very clear. So you want to have that in place from the onset. So this is something that that does help with respect to just building a credible board structure. Then with respect to the director's duties, something that I had just alluded to. So the starting point is acting in good faith and the best interest of the company. So earlier on, I had even mentioned that if the company is not compliant with various laws, in addition to the company being fined, which people get imprisoned, it's the directors. And I think it's something that you've seen in the news. So what does acting in good faith mean? And this is something that is found in the Companies Act. All these duties that you're seeing are found in the Companies Act. So the starting point is, if you're a founder or director, if you're a founder or director, it's important to know that the way you act as a director and the way you act as a founder, this is separate. As a shareholder, this is something separate. As a director, you need to make sure that all the decisions that you're making are in the best interest of the specific company, that you're making decisions that can help the company financially, commercially. Your decisions have to be commercially sound. You cannot put your own interests above the company. Just because you put in capital in the company, it doesn't mean you can do whatever you want. So you have to put the company's needs above the personal gain that you want to make. So even when it comes to getting a loan, you can't just get money from the company because you want to get a loan. There are procedures that you need to follow. That's the transparency we talked about. These things have to be documented. You can't just take money anyhow. You have to be fair in how you're making decisions with the company. It has to be aligned with the company's purpose. So if you've said that the company is supposed to be used for this specific purpose, that's the direction you must go in. Investors do look at that. You also have to consider the best interest of, if you have other minority shareholders, consider their interest. You have employees, consider their interest. You have customers. So if you're a financial institution, there's a minimum capital you need to have. Even the way you make decisions, remember that you have these clients. You can't just run the business in any way, because some of the decisions you make can be very detrimental to people who invest with you. So these are things that you need to take into account. Then the other one, exercise care, skill, and diligence. I've mentioned this today. Ignorance is not an excuse. You need to participate actively. If you are a director, you can't just, you put your name there, you say, I'm a director of this company. You must actively know what's going on in the company and participate, not just hold title, because of what? The consequences that I did mention. And as you are participating in the company, you must exercise care, skill, and due diligence as you are running the company. So you need to make informed decisions. It's so important. So if you're holding yourself out to be a particular expert, you need to act with that specific expertise. So it's important. You need to ask questions. Can I see the finances? Can I see the reports? That's why we mentioned that it's important to know which people, that what are the roles and responsibilities, so that you know the specific people who are in charge of just the different aspects. So every director of a company, so you're a co-founder, you're also a director. As a director, you must exercise care and skill as you run the specific company, even if you're not a finance expert. So, when we're in school, math can be, for some, was quite challenging. If you're a director, you need to understand what's going on with the company. If you want, you can get someone to explain it to you, but you need to understand the basic financial statements. You need to understand. The minute that you're a director, that's why I mentioned that at PACRA, the records are updated. So it's so important. If you know you're a director of a company, know what's happening within the company. What's the cash flow like, even if you have a different role, but it's so important for you to have that. So that's exercising care, skill, and diligence. Then with respect to conflict of interest, so this is where you, as a director, you have a personal interest in something. For example, the company wants to execute a contract, and there's a personal interest. Maybe it wants to execute a contract with another business of yours. So you have two businesses. So the name of so you are a director of business A, and then in business B, you're a shareholder. So business B comes and it says, oh, can we enter into this contract? And then what do? You cannot keep quiet before business A. Before it enters into that agreement, you need to disclose, because there's a conflict of interest. You'll be pushing that contract to say, no, just sign this contract. There is a conflict. You have an interest in this specific contract because you're a shareholder. You're going to make money from this contract. So the starting point is avoid. If you cannot avoid, disclose. And these disclosures are made. So I spoke about resolutions. That's the importance of resolutions and minutes. In those resolutions and minutes, it will be shown that this director disclosed, and as the other directors, we don't see any issues with us proceeding. So it's so important to keep that in mind, that at all times, any conflict of interest, if you have an interest in something and the company wants to enter into the contract or engage, you have to disclose this. Then I've already mentioned about the importance of keeping proper records and also just ensuring compliance. So these are the duties that directors must keep into account, as you, as the owners of startups, are both the members and also the directors. You need to understand what your duties are in your role as a director.
Thank you so much for running us through the legal duties of the directors. But now maybe we get a little practical. What are the key compliance steps every founder should check off? I'm talking about PACRA filings, tax obligations. It could be labor compliance, data protection, and other key areas. Could you just quickly run us through what that pack simply looks like for founders? Chimomo, are you there? Your mic is muted.
So With respect to the compliance pack, so I have mentioned the PACRA filings, the tax obligations, labor obligations, and data protection. One thing I would want to mention is anti-money laundering. So depending on the sector that you're in, you could be a reporting entity, which is an entity that has to report to the Financial Intelligence Center regarding any money laundering that's occurring, if there are any suspicious transactions. It just depends on the sector that you're operating in. So if you operate in this sector, you have additional obligations under the law in Zambia to, firstly, you need to have some KYC policies. What are these? It's know your customer. Before you enter into an agreement with a customer, before you commence, you need to ensure that you've obtained specific information to identify them, to also understand where their income is coming from. You just want to have a very good appreciation of who your customer is. And there's also an obligation for you to verify. You can't just obtain the information, but you need to verify. And what we've seen is most people ask, so how do I verify? So that's something that I think we'll tackle in subsequent sessions, but it's just to know that depending on the sector that you're operating in, you would need to comply with the anti-money laundering obligations. Then also ensure that you know that the specific licenses, and I think I won't belabor the point with respect to what I have mentioned, but we just wanted that you're able to at least take a screenshot of this, just for you to, after this session, to see if with respect to PACRA, you'll see, have I ever filed annual returns? You need to check. So please obtain the printout. You need to see, have I ever registered the changes in the company? You need to see that. From a tax point of view, you need to say, what do my finance books look like? Have I registered for the correct taxes? You need to start asking yourself these questions. And you also need to ask, so all of you have employees, so you collect personal data, you have customers. So are you registered with the Data Protection Commission? You are a data controller, you are a data processor. Are you registered? So that's something you need to ask. Then, are you transferring data? Where is your data sitting? Are you transferring it outside Zambia? You need to ask yourself these questions. So the compliance pack as a business is something that will help you just to know what you should be compliant with, and you're taking to say, this is to say that you're compliant. And outside, so in as much as the obligation is on you, there are outside resources. So you do have advisors who can help you be compliant. I think that's something that should take into account, because a lot of you are wondering, saying, I've mentioned these laws, but there are many, many, many others that I haven't highlighted. So how should you ensure that you're compliant? So I think in as much as there are resources that you can find online, there are also practitioners, legal practitioners, who can help you just to ensure that you're compliant, because the obligation at the end of the day is on you as a founder, as a director of the company, to ensure compliance with the legal and regulatory framework in Zambia.
Amazing. So what would you say are the common startup compliance mistakes that usually most founders make with regards to their compliance issues?
So these are some common mistakes that we've seen. So you start your business and you say, I'll regularize my affairs later. For now, let me make money. No, this is very problematic. If you start doing this, you keep operating, you'll find yourself in this big ditch, and then you're non-compliant. And the next thing, you're receiving all these notices from various regulators. You don't want that. I think prevention is just better from the onset, to prevent these regulators approaching you. You want to ensure that from the beginning you're compliant. So please do not say you'll fix it later. Start now. If you've seen certain laws that you're not compliant with, it's not too late. You can start regularizing your affairs. If you haven't been keeping board minutes because you're saying this is a small business, if you want to obtain funding, you need to start. So one of the biggest things, issues that we've seen is most companies will say, I'm a startup, I'm a smaller business, so I don't see the need for us to have board resolutions. We don't even have a board. You have those two directors because that's a minimum. If you have one director, you are not compliant with the law. So with those two directors, keep minutes regularly of all the decisions you are making. This is something that's important. Register your directors at PACRA. Don't just appoint people. You appoint someone as a director, but then this is not registered at PACRA. You're not being compliant with the Companies Act. Register that director, because even if you're in the financial sector and you're approaching the Bank of Zambia or even other regulators, they ask for the printout from PACRA, and then you're not registered there. You have to start the process. You don't even know how to do this. If you had been doing that from the beginning, when the requirement comes to provide this information, you already have it. So it's important, register your directors and also register any other changes within the company. It's important to do that. Please file your taxes. The penalties with the ZRA are quite high. And then we don't know if you'll be caught for tax evasion, if it will be tax avoidance. You want to avoid that. People have been found themselves, arrested in prison for issues with the tax authorities, and the ZRA has a lot of power. So I know I'm very passionate. I do specialize in tax law, so this is something that I see regularly. So please keep your records, pay your tax, and there'll be no issues. If you have your records, let's say you're struggling as a company, you are genuinely struggling and you can't pay your taxes. It is possible to approach the regulator and explain the predicament that you're in and pay tax over a period of time. But how can you even show the regulator to say that you are struggling? How can you show them if you don't even have your finances? You have to show the regulator saying, look at our finances. We genuinely cannot pay. And the regulator can say, okay, then this is how we'll structure the payments based on your profits. But without the specific documents, you cannot even approach any regulators. How do you approach NAPSA to show them that you're not able to pay employees, you're not able to pay? How do you approach if you don't have your records in order? So for startups, the biggest issue we've seen is that the startups do not keep proper records of information. And this even affects how the regulators can assist them because they have nothing to work with. Then many startups don't know the specific licenses that they should have for their operations. So it's a common thing that we've seen. And then so you want to avoid those reputational risks of you being posted in the newspaper or online as someone who was sanctioned for operating, even when you meant well. You have this business that is amazing. It's helping Zambians, the public, and you're making a good profit. But then you're sanctioned, you're told to stop operating because you didn't obtain a license, or maybe you just didn't obtain the appropriate license. So ignorance is not a defense. The law is quite clear. You just want to avoid any sanctions for having the wrong license or for having unlicensed operation. Then going to what I had mentioned before, from an employment perspective, please have the written contract, it's important for you to have the shareholders agreement, and even agreements with, if you provide services, have agreements with your customers. People are quite litigious. So working in the legal field, we see a lot of issues, and these issues come from well-meaning people. So from the get-go, you trusted this person, you had a good relationship and you meant well, but without a written agreement, you are not protected. This written agreement would make clear exactly what the obligations are. Someone can say, I'm going to court. That's fine, because the courts will find in your favor as there is a signed written agreement. The courts are going to uphold that agreement. So please, with respect to the different things, the suppliers that you have, please have a written agreement in place. So this is something that has to be done. Ensure that you have a legal practitioner look at that agreement to see that you're protected. encrypted, because a common mistake we've seen is people will get something from the internet, and then remember that these things you get from the internet also come from different jurisdictions. You get something from the UK, you get something from Europe, you sign it, and then when you go before the courts, they say it's not enforceable. Why? Because there are specific things that you didn't know that should have been in the agreement. So it's just important from the onset to get proper advice to have these agreements, so that these specific agreements that you sign are actually enforceable in the courts of law here in Zambia. But even before you approach the courts, if you have a written agreement, someone sends you a letter of demand and says you didn't do this, you just show them, but according to clause this and this, I'm not required to do that. It's not my obligation. And the issue ends there. That's the beauty about written agreements. Reduce everything in writing, even the oral discussions that you have. Make sure you reduce them in writing. So based on that, I did mention the mistakes, but I also want to provide you with solutions. And these are things that I already mentioned. The solutions to avoid those mistakes, what investors are looking at. So the clean cap table, it's really the ownership structure. The investor wants to make sure that they understand what is the ownership structure, the agreements, who owns this. So this is something that from the onset has to be very clear to an investor. So file that information, because sometimes shares have been transferred, but then you haven't registered that at PACRA, and they're telling the investor, oh, I'm the new shareholder. The investor is looking at the records at the company's registry. You are not on those records. Now you have, so the investor is not happy with that. So it's important from the beginning to ensure that at each stage, you have to update the ownership structure, the beneficial ownership. The investor wants to know this. If you're going to be telling the investor that I own the company, they look at the company records and they are seeing someone else there as a shareholder, and they ask, okay, I'm seeing this other person, but you're saying you own the company. You just direct them to the portion on the company printout that says you are the beneficial owner. So it's easy for them to invest in that case. That's the beauty of the transparency that is there. It shows that even though you are not the shareholder there, you are the beneficial owner. So even the independent board, it's something I've mentioned. Please ensure you have policies in place for the different, for just different aspects within the business, how the board runs the business, with respect to the employees. Those policies will guide. Ensure you have records and have an audit trail. So in as much as I mentioned the audit aspect with respect to the financials, under the Data Protection Act, it also requires people to come and audit you to see if you're compliant. There are other acts. So I had mentioned the Bank of Zambia. They want to see, are you compliant? Different regulators want to see if you're compliant. There's ZRA audits. Some people, so as you expand, even as a startup, you know where we are right now. We want revenue for our country. So what happens in that case? You're audited to see if you're not paying your taxes. So there are different audits that happen. So ensure that in every aspect, you do keep a good audit trail. Keep those board minutes, because I've highlighted there, no board minutes is a red flag. It means you're running your company anyhow. So I hope this is something that you've taken into account for your business. If you don't have board minutes, it's time to start that. I know the year is coming to an end, but it's not too late to reduce those meetings you had in writing as you are considering having more investors in your business. Or even if this is the first investor, just ensure that what I've mentioned, if you can have those things in order, even as legal practitioners, conducting a due diligence on your business, they'll say, oh, with this business, I don't see risk. Maybe there's one thing you haven't done. That won't be problematic, because they'll say, but in these other areas, they're compliant. So generally, this company is compliant, so you can invest. So this is very helpful with capital raising. Then from a licensing point of view, it's really just what I've mentioned. If you want to raise capital, just also ensure that you do have that you do have up-to-date licenses. People will ask, do you have if you say you've registered, the investor wants to see a registration certificate. So some people have said, but I registered. Do you have a registration certificate? Because that shows compliance. You say you pay NAFSA. Do you have the certificate? So this is important. PACRA filing history. I can go to Pakra right now, do a search, see what the history is. I can obtain the information. This is something that we do as legal practitioners before we provide before we advise an investor to actually invest in a company. Then for the companies that we help with compliance, so because we also deal with companies from a regulatory point of view, we also advise them what they should have in place. So what we do is a health check. So we see, can you provide us with this information to see if you're compliant, to see what's up to date? So we also help the company to just put their affairs in order to prepare them for the investments that's to come. So it's just something to keep into account. That's why I have highlighted that seek guidance before you even apply, because you don't want to approach an investor and then the investor is going to invest they're going to get a legal practitioner to look at your affairs. So if before, one of the best examples I'll give you is one company wanted investment, and before they even approached the investor, they made their legal team had put all the company's affairs in order. When the lawyers on the other side asked for the information, it was readily available. Within, I think it was less than a month, the company received the funding. These are success stories that we want. So earlier on, when Kasiko asked me, I've seen these success stories, and seeing these success stories, I know that can happen for you. Do you want to raise capital? If you put your affairs in order, I can assure you people will invest in you. People are receiving these funds. So the starting point is just regularize your affairs, and the money is definitely going to come because investors are willing to invest. Yes, they are looking at the profitability, but they are also looking at the corporate governance of the business.
Amazing. Thanks for that. So what would you say are some of the actions that founders should take in the next 90 days with regards to their businesses in relation to corporate governance?
I think it's really what I've just mentioned. I think a recap is just update your records. And if you haven't, I think especially where I asked you to take screenshots, update your records at Parker. Please do that. I mentioned that 15,000 authorized shares and the 20,000. Get that Parker printout. Check if you're compliant. If you're not, comply. If you haven't updated Parker, please do that. Formalize your board meetings. You need to do that. Draft the policies. If you need help, seek guidance. Register for tax and data protection registration. You need to comply. So, and even for several businesses, understand, do I need to get a specific license for my business? How do I go about it? So the 90-day action plan right now is, I think as the year is coming to an end, so this should be a 2025 action plan where in October, you need to regularize your affairs. And what I've mentioned, these are quick wins. These are not difficult things to do. Drafting policies is not difficult. As your business expands, you have more detailed policies, but as a startup, you do need a few policies just to show that you are running your business in just a compliant way, and that your corporate governance, just to show that it is compliant. Then for some resources, in as much as I did mention that you seek guidance, as you can see here, these are some links you can look at. So you have the PACRA website. It does have information there. You have the Bank of Zambia website. It has a lot of information. So if you're providing some financial services, the Securities and Exchange Commission. So if you look at their website, there is material there. So the starting point is this information is readily available. The regulators regularly publish. Then you also have the ZRA. So so after you look at this, if you're still confused, you don't know how to comply, and then you're also trying to make money, so that you can seek legal advice in order to know exactly how you comply. Because yes, there are these resources. If you have time, you go over them, but there are people who can help you with respect to just putting your affairs in order, in readiness for investors to invest in your business.
Amazing. So what are some of the lessons our founders are to walk away with tonight? Just in a nutshell, what could you share from the discussion that we have had throughout today's webinar?
I think I would just want you to take away everything that I've said. The starting point is people are willing to invest in your business. The capital is there. We've seen it because one of our practice areas is project financing. We do deal with that. We do help people in that area, and also we deal with mergers and acquisitions. So we've seen that there are a lot of investors, and Zambia is ripe for investment. That's the main purpose of this. There are a lot of startups, and startups grow quickly. All these companies that you see started as a startup, unless it's a subsidiary. But the idea behind it is if you can just if right now you can regularize your affairs, I think the key lesson is you will get the funding. If you want to sell your company at some point, or if you want to even go public, if you want the public to buy shares in your company, you cannot do that if you're not compliant, if your corporate governance is not in order. So it's just something to keep to just take into account. So also be practical. You cannot be perfect. So we're in October right now, and we're coming to the end of the year. You can't do everything at once. So you need to start. Start with a simple board, but have that board. You have those two directors. Can you reduce what you're doing in writing? Have clear processes. Understand what you're doing. I hope it's something that you've taken into account. Ensure you have the right licenses, but even for companies that have been operating for a long time, they are not perfect. You see several issues with companies. Why? The idea is if you are compliant, even when it comes to a regulator, you can just show them, like, let's say if you have an issue with a specific regulator, if you can show some form of compliance, you can even avoid getting a fine. Why? Because they've seen that you're compliant and it was just an oversight on your part. But if there's just ignorance, honestly, at that stage, there's nothing the regulator can do. So having some form of compliance can help you not just from an investor point of view, but also to avoid these fines that take away from your profits. This is something that's helpful. So I think this is just the key takeaway. If you want to expand your business, if you want to grow, if you want to get the money, we've seen it. The money is there. Investors want to invest in your business. But before they do that, what do they want to see? Sustainability. How are you running the business? Is it sustainable? Or will it be liquidated because you're taking money out of the company just anyhow? Because you're the founder, you're a director. The investors want to see that. So I think these are the key takeaways. I want you to see that this is doable. It's very, very doable. I know it might seem daunting, but it's quite doable. There are several things I haven't mentioned, some websites I haven't mentioned. There are several laws I haven't mentioned, and we will deal with them in the subsequent sessions. But I hope that this has really helped you to understand what you can start doing in order to get that money.
Thank you so much, Chimwemwe, for that. That was quite insightful, and I believe the people that are on the call with us today have gotten a lot in terms of what they should do, from compliance issues to regulatory issues to how to file their taxes. I know we did not dive deep into the nitty-gritties of it, and that's why this was tagged as our first session, just corporate governance 101. So we were just scratching the surface of what corporate governance is. And before we can conclude our webinar, we would like to hear, I've seen some questions in the chat, and there are quite a number, but I will request that you just raise your hand so that you interact with Chimwemwe. You can just raise your hand and ask your question, and then we will be able to address it. So I will allow for at least the first three questions, and then we have a link, or an email rather, in the chat, tagged Mariah at bongohive.co.zm. So make sure you send all these questions that you have to that email, and we will be able to address all of them in our next webinar. This is only our first one. We were just scratching the surface. So right about now, I'll just request that you just raise your hand and ask your question. I will take the first three questions.
Hello. Hello.
Yes,
Um,
please go ahead.
all right, my name is Cassius. Anyway, I've got a question specifically about startups that are very, very early. Now, I joined a few minutes earlier, so I might have missed it if you talked about it. But otherwise, does this all this compliance apply to companies that are not even making any revenue yet, right? That don't even have a proven concept yet, that are throwing ideas around? Because you're talking about things like signups, and you need to get all of this, um, compliance documents and all of that. But then, how does a startup of that size just do all of that? Yeah, that's my question.
Thank you, Cassius, for that question. So the starting point is company filings. Yes, as a startup, before you even start operating, you need to incorporate your company at PACRA. That's the starting point. So once you incorporate your company at PACRA, even if you're not doing anything, you need to file those annual returns. So this is a requirement. So there are several requirements that you need to comply with. So with respect to tax, I had mentioned that when you register your company, when you incorporate it at PACRA, usually there's that automatic registration that's there. You're given a TPIN with respect to taxes. So if you have to file new returns, you're not making any money, that has to be done. Because what happens is that if you're not filing new returns, you're still figuring out the operations, the ZRL will make an assessment and you start having a back and forth with them when you're not even operating. So this is something that you need to consider. So for VAT, it depends on the startups. There are some startups we've seen that know from the beginning, based on the structure of their business, that they would be required to register for VAT. Because with respect to VAT, it's if you think that if looking at the turnover that you have, if you see that you fall within the prescribed threshold, or you need to make that determination. So if you see that you fall within the prescribed threshold within that year when you're operating, there was that requirement to also register. Then with respect to NAPSA, do you have employees? So I know you're figuring things out. If it's just you as a founder and you don't have any employees, that's different. But if you have one employee, that worker who is cleaning your business, the person that's helping you to run around, are they your employee or are they an independent contractor? That's why I did mention the importance of having agreements, because the agreement will be very clear that the person that's helping you out is not your employee, but they are an independent contractor, which means that even from a tax perspective, the taxes payable, it wouldn't be pay as you earn, but in that case, it would be a withholding tax, as they are independent, they're an independent consultant. But one thing I would also like to mention is that sometimes people structure things to appear as if someone is independent, but they are but the way the person is operating, it's as if they're an employee. So that's something that's called tax avoidance. It's something that's considered, but we'll discuss in other sessions, where you want to structure your affairs even as a startup in a way to avoid tax or compliance. It could be problematic, but have the agreement and ensure that the particular person who is helping you out, if they're a consultant, you withhold that withholding tax on the amount that you're paying them, or if they're an employee, you have to remit pay as you earn. Then if they're an employee, you also have NEMA, you also need to comply with the employment code, data protection. You are going to be getting personal data from employees. So from the beginning, you want to make sure you've registered, because yes, you're a startup, but sometimes these registration processes can take long. So you want to ensure that you've registered, you've seen, am I a data controller? Will I be collecting personal data? And you attend to that registration. If as a startup, you think you'll be transferring data outside Zambia, then there's also the additional requirement to just obtain approval for that. Then also depending on your business, if you're in the financial services sector, you are definitely a reporting entity. So there's compliance that you need to deal with under the FIC Act. So there are many acts that require your compliance, even as you're putting your affairs in order, even some sort of registration. So someone can help you to know when you need to comply, because there are certain laws that are there which can say, okay, while you're in that startup phase, with respect to compliance, it can come later. So that advice with respect to other taxes, or other laws can only come in, I think, when someone has a better appreciation of your business. But yes, from the onset, you do need to be compliant, or at least tell the regulators that at this stage you're not doing anything. One thing I would like to mention is in Zambia, regulators do share information all the time. So you've registered at PACRA. PACRA has informed other regulators. So you're not operating, but you find a regulator writing to you saying, what's going on here? You don't want that. So from the onset, even as a startup, Cassius, it's important for you to understand at which points you need to comply and which acts you need to start complying with now.
Thank you for that response, Chimwemwe. Just to note, we have taken note of Virginia's question, Lewis, as well as Loiso, and everybody else that has asked questions. I will allow for one more question. You can just raise your hand and unmute your mic. Okay, maybe we'll take Virginia's. Is this a question? Or is it a comment? Oh, I think she's asking what different tax returns suit different business lines. I don't know, Chimomo, if you could shed some light on that briefly before we end our session.
So thank you, Virginia, for that question. So this is quite specific to your business, no matter how small it is. So I'll give you an example of the different businesses that are out there. For example, if you started a small business and it's in the betting and gaming sector, so in this case, what should be looking at, even for the tax types, the returns that should be making, it would be presumptive tax. It would be presumptive tax. So if you're operating, if you're in the taxi business, or if you're operating minibuses, you have that kind of business. So this is something that many startups have. You have 3 minibuses. This is your specific business. So again, that's presumptive tax. Then if you have this financial services business, then there you would be looking at turnover tax. Then if you're obtaining rental income, so it's really quite specific to the business. And then for tax returns, you wouldn't just be looking at the returns that the business is making. You also need to remember that you're also looking at the employees. You need to be compliant, because if you're not paying that pay as you earn for the employees, do you know who is liable? It's you. So at the end of the day, it's something, the obligation for you to comply with that. So you also need to make returns with respect to the employees. Even if you have 2 employees, you have 1 employee, you need to do that. It does add up, and the penalties and the interest really is quite high. Then also, in as much as it's a small business, depending on the turnover, you may also need to register for VAT. So the only way someone can advise on the specific taxes is to look at your business, because there are some companies which are startups, and I know, but could even be required to not be on the turnover tax regime, but the corporate income tax. So that's something different. So with the turnover, I think the corporate income tax, in as much as we'll go into the tax session some other time. I'm very passionate about tax, but just to know that even with what I've mentioned, there are benefits with respect to the different tax regimes, and that's some advice that you can get to understand that, okay, in as much as I'm filing these tax returns, what can I do for my business in order, for example, to get some deductions, in order for me to even reduce the tax? So that's tax planning. It's not tax avoidance. It's something that can be done, but someone would need to sit with you just to understand the exact tax returns, the exact the tax types that you should also be registered for, what should be accounting for, and also advise you how you can also legally reduce the tax that you're paying. It's something that can be done.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that, Chimwemwe. So as we conclude our session, please remember to send in all your questions to mariah@bongohive.co.zm. All questions will be taken note of and addressed in our next information session. Like I said, this was just us scratching the surface with regards to corporate governance, and that's why we tagged it Corporate Governance 101. And we are grateful to all of you for taking time to attend this webinar, and we look forward to you attending the next one, where all your questions will be addressed and more light will be shared on the various topics. Right about now, I'll just invite Chimwemwe to just share some closing remarks as we close this session. Over to you, Chimwemwe.
Thank you, Kasiku. So I really hope that I think the key takeaways that I mentioned will resound with you, because I think even as a legal practitioner, I do enjoy helping startups in as much as I conduct due diligences for, as a firm, we do that for investors, but we also do that for startups. So please, after this, I would like to ask that you go and look at the way you're running the company. You look at your records and you see where the gaps are. If you need help, please ask. But just for you, the key takeaway for you is the money is there if you need to finance your business. But even before you consider approaching someone to help you, just put some of these things in place. If you're in doubt, please ask. I think if you're not, there are various people who are willing to help. If from a legal perspective, you really can seek legal practitioners' advice. But I hope the resources that I've given you can help you right now, just as you are conducting your own personal due diligence before you even go out there to see how you have been running your business, so that by the time, I think next year, so you have this 90 days or just these few months to put some things in order, so that even at the beginning of the year, you can now start approaching investors and you will get that money. So thank you so much, everyone, for listening. I hope what I said does resound and help your startup.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Chimwemwe. So from Chimwemwe Walia, MOIRA Legal Practitioners, the details are on the attached slide. Please do reach out. And from me, Kasiku Kayuma here at BongoHive, thank you so much for joining this webinar. We look forward to seeing you in